Hey, so I want to do a discussion on Puerto Rico today.
Ooh, let's
Necessar-
do it.
it's not necessarily good news, but this
I
is a
know.
talk that we need to have.
It's true, but it's good that we're talking about what's going on in the beautiful Isla del Encanto.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that we just don't get a lot of news about Puerto Rico over here. You have to actively pursue that in order to be aware of what's happening. It's not like for news, things that are happening in states. I know Puerto Rico is a commonwealth, but it's always like an afterthought,
It's interesting that you use the Commonwealth. It's not like the Commonwealth of Virginia
right?
or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's a colony of the United States of America.
Well, yeah, yeah,
Para
and
clarificar, ¿ok?
yeah, it's essentially, and that's going to paint the entire discussion. Like, I think we're going to be able to see that a lot of what's happening is because it does function in effectively as a colony, or they treat it as a colony, even though they use fancy language like, oh, it's a commonwealth. It's like it has limited status, or it has some type of unique relationship with the states. It's a colony set up for exploitation, and you're seeing the consequences of it. And so what I want to talk about is the Puerto Rican economic crisis, which has been, it's kind of snowballing in the last decade. And you see a headline here and there, and now that we're seeing more headlines with now possible austerity measures that are affecting the population. And then you have the teachers, the students coming out and complaining because at the end of the day, whenever there's a crisis, whenever the government's in trouble, they always try to go for the social programs, and they try to cut back on that. So there's some tension there. But if you want to trace it back, I mean, we don't have to go all the way to like when the U.S. took Puerto Rico from Spain and like 70s or nothing like that. We could start with the tax law that essentially gave corporate subsidies for corporations to make it attractive to them to essentially go into Puerto Rico. And if you look, here's an article. If you read the language of what they're using, they're saying that they were trying to promote the industrialization and development of Puerto Rico. But as you put it earlier, another way of just phrasing that is they try to set it up so that corporations could go in there and exploit, because they had subsidies. They could then pay out the dividends to their parent corporation in the U.S. and not have to like pay any taxes. So they set this up to essentially have the corporations go in there and do this. But then they started phasing out these subsidies back in 1996. And so they phased out, I believe, over a 10-year period. And that's around the time where a lot of companies started relocating out of Puerto Rico. So it had a significant impact on the economy. So by the time you get to, say, the economic crisis in the U.S. in 2008, you already had all of that going on in Puerto Rico. And then that affected them even more. So you've had this exodus of talent and a net outflow also of people from Puerto Rico going to states like Florida and Texas and New York. And so on top of that, you also had the hurricane that hit them a few years ago. And so that's
It was
just made the
Irma
situation
and
even
Maria.
worse.
It was Hurricane Irma and Maria,
Irma was,
particularly Maria.
yeah, I think at least from what I recall, Maria was the one that was, at least
Yeah,
it
the more
seemed like it was,
devastating one.
yeah, more devastating than the previous one. Here's
Yes.
something interesting also that I didn't know, and again, just on the theme of Puerto Rico being more like a colony than anything else. It says that in 1968, essentially Congress placed a cap on Medicaid funding for U.S. territories.
Hmm.
So essentially, it leads to a situation where Puerto Rico, having the same or almost the same population as a state like Mississippi, they only could get around 373 million, whereas a state like Mississippi would get 3.6 billion for Medicaid funding. Same amount of people, right? So it
Not only that, but they're American citizens too.
right, exactly. So what they're like second class American citizens, and they're treated that way. They're like, well, yeah, you're American citizens, you're technically part of the U.S., but we're just not going to give you the same amount of funding for your social programs. We're going to let corporations go in there and set up a system where they exploit, and maybe when it proves that maybe it's not working out as we intended for the corporations, then they're just going to pull out and leave you to suffer the consequences. And now,
Hmm.
instead of letting them restructure, or instead of working with them to, because Puerto Rico can't file for bankruptcy, so they're in a difficult situation. But they set up this I think was it 2016 or 2015, they set up this Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, which is now trying to see how they can restructure all of this debt. And I think we're still kind of in the process of this trying to work something out. And now you're starting to get to we get to these protests that have manifested recently, where is the result of this oversight committee trying to see how they can essentially restructure the debt, which means cutting back on a lot of public social programs like education and then pensions. And so, yeah, so that's just at a high level some of the key features. I know that, I'm sure there's a long history here.
Yes, and I think that's part of the issue now, that I mean, the Puerto Rican government has incentives to try to get people to come to Puerto Rico and live there at least half the year, so they can take advantage of tax benefits. But yeah, to your point, the broader issue here is that, not only you have a federal entity in control of the island's finances, but you also are limited to what you can do, because, to your point, you're not a state, so there's not a lot of things that you can do that any other state will be able to do, and you're not an independent country, so there's other things, there's not treaties or other things that you are even able to do, and some of the ways that some of the high costs that the island has to or those folks in the island have to deal with are due to the fact that, anything that's shipped to Puerto Rico has to be sent there via a ship with a U.S. flag. So a lot of goods have to come back to Florida and then ship to Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of ways that I know that, and that's the issue. The relationship with the United States kind of had a lot to do with what can happen or cannot happen economically in the island.
And also, just to be fair, let's also not forget about good old corruption.
Yeah.
And ineffective leaders, corrupt leaders. So that's at play as well. We can't just pin everything on the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, to the extent that we acknowledge that relationship does promote a certain type of corruption in itself. But even if the U.S. was not in the picture, then just naturally, as we've seen in other Latin American countries, there's just this type of corruption that it's there from the very founding of those nations, the way that the Spanish came in and set these systems of or these economies up more for exploitation and plunder, instead of trying to set up like long-term sustainable living, right? So some of that history can be traced back in Puerto Rico also to the original colonization, but just good old corruption is at play here as well, and it just makes things worse.
Very true. And I think for those of you who want to learn a little bit more about some of the history and some of the things that are happening in Puerto Rico, there's a really good podcast called La Brega, and for Puerto Ricans, and then actually
La Brega?
The first La Brega.
Brega, Brega?
Yeah, La Brega.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, so that podcast there by WNYC Studios and Futuro Studios just tells a little bit more about the history of Puerto Rico, including, everything that went down between the U.S. and Spain after the war, some of the ways that the CIA and the FBI persecuted folks who were calling for the independence of the island, to the emergence of Luis Marin, who became the first governor, and kind of this concept of the Commonwealth. And in some ways, it's a difficult question, right? Because there's a lot about Puerto Rico that is tied to the United States, but it has a rich history and culture of its own.
La Brega, for those of you that are interested in that, check them out. I actually haven't listened to any of these episodes. I don't even know what does brega mean.
Yeah, so for Puerto Ricans, and I think to an extent Colombians too, la brega is kind of to the hustle. So
Okay.
you're always hustling. La brega es estar bregando con algo. It's like
Mm.
you're estar bregando con la vida, or con el trabajo. So la brega is just kind of this is a very Puerto Rican saying, but a saying that's also used in throughout Latin America. But and actually, I think the first episode kind of breaks down what the brega means
Hmm.
for different people.
Yeah, we usually is that word somehow related to, does it have its like origins in just regular work? Like is it somehow associated with the word job or work instead of, or is it just hustle, like more linked to hustle?
That's a good question.
The
We would
it,
need to
the reason why I ask is because in Spanish in Mexico we have similar terminology to describe like the hustle, but a lot
mhm.
of those words are linked to the actual word of job or trabajo. Jalar. Jalar literally means like pulling, which is like, manual labor. So for slang, you would say, vamos a jalar, échale ganas, vamos a trabajar.
Aquí estamos en el jale.
En el jale, right? We don't have an exact word for hustle, or at least not one that is like common. So anyhow, listeners out there can go and check out what la brega and the origin of that word is. Let me switch back here to this video that I was listening to earlier when I was trying to just get a more of a full view of the Puerto Rican crisis from different channels, because you always want to pick up a little bit of information from different perspectives just to see what different sides have to say. But one of these videos that I saw earlier was like a quick 2-minute video explaining to you what the current crisis is and what are some possible solutions. It was funny because one of the solutions was to incentivize corporations to go in there again by getting rid of by having no minimum wage law. And I was thinking like, I
It's like,
suppose
no, that doesn't work.
I suppose you could help a group of people through exploitation. You let companies go in there and you let the companies exploit the workforce and then generate some economic activity as a result of that exploitation. But chances are, if you're letting especially U.S. corporations go in there, they get to exploit the cheap labor. They're just going to take the profits and find a way to invest them back into the main company or back into the U.S. There's no guarantee that they're going to reinvest that money into the island, even despite the fact that they'll be exploiting. So I have to question whether or not I agree with that solution. It must have been a conservative video that I ended up watching.
Yeah, that sounds like trickle down economics at its core.
It's not even that difficult to. Maybe it is. Maybe I just need to have a debate with one of these guys. But what is it about the people that are against minimum wage what is it that they don't understand, that the workers just don't have any leverage in a capitalist economy like the U.S. or Puerto Rico? Like they always say, well, if you don't like the job, you can always go work somewhere else. I'm like, no, not really.
Yeah.
When you're facing either you feed your family or you go take a shitty job, you don't just say, well, I'm not going to take that shitty job and I'm just going to go work somewhere else. You don't really have those options. So the only way that getting rid of a minimum wage would actually make sense, and if, again, for Puerto Rico, would be if the corporations that went in there said, all right, we're just going to pay what the market is willing to take in terms of wages. Well, that assumes that the Puerto Ricans would have some leverage in terms of being able to like withhold their labor from these companies, and then they would make the wages go up, and then the market would set a rate. But it doesn't work out like that. People are going to work because they're desperate and they need a job and they need to eat, and they're going to take shittier and shittier wages. What, $3, $4, $5 an hour? I don't even know in Puerto Rico how much it would be.
Yeah, and now I think that to your point, it's interesting that now throughout the United States there's an increased organization by labor unions, right? And particularly because how many of them, how hard they worked during the pandemic, but I think a realization that what they're getting paid is not enough. So it's interesting to see that there's a renaissance of labor organizing and workers being willing to get on the picket line to demand better working wages, particularly now as you have the disruptions that not only happen because of the pandemic, but also because of the technology, right? So the gig
Hmm.
economy and the ways that everything is changing right now. But you're right. I think that what companies need to go back to is the lessons from Henry Ford. You got to take care of your employees, pay them enough so they can buy your product and other products and keep the economy going.
Yeah. Well, that may work for companies here in the U.S., but when it comes to Puerto Rico, again, it's treated like a colony. So corporations aren't going to Puerto Rico to try to raise the standard of living. They're going there because they think they can exploit legally
Not cheap labor.
without having to.
And by the way, you should,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I was going to say that you should talk about the the folks who are trying to go to take crypto to Puerto Rico.
Oh yeah, there was this other video of this group of crypto investors that were trying to go in there to introduce some type of, I don't remember the specifics of it. We should definitely do another episode on it so I can go back and pull the actual, like, the situation of what's going on. But essentially the video that we were watching, it boils down to some crypto investors going into the island, starting some ventures or some initiatives, and then telling the local population that it's going to be to their benefit. And then everyone in that meeting's like, no, we don't think this is going to help us. Like, how does it help us? You guys are going to come in here and exploit, and you're making it seem like you're coming here to as saviors to save us. And then they managed to find a guy that looked to be Puerto Rican, or he looked like he was black, but he was the one that was speaking. And then you had all the other white crypto investors kind of standing behind them. And then this guy was like trying to explain to them, look, you may not understand it, but this is going to benefit you, and you may not like it, but it's going to benefit you. And we're going to come in here and we're going to, essentially, he was saying, we're going to do these things, and then you're going to see how it benefits you. You know?
Hmm.
But I don't remember the specifics of it, though. So that's something that we're going to have to come back to, crypto in Puerto Rico, and see what exactly was going on with that situation. The other thing, sorry, before I switch to another topic, is, so those strikes, you have the strikes with I believe Kellogg's, you have the John Deere strikes, and then well, the main one that's been on the headlines is John Deere, where they were threatening to cut the medical coverage for the workers. I think they pulled back on that. They must have gotten a backlash. But yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely, because of COVID, is making things a lot more dire for a lot of people. So you are starting to see this mass mobilization.
Hmm.
We didn't even cover how COVID made all of this even worse, right? The situation with Puerto Rico did not start because of COVID. It didn't start because of Hurricane Maria. Those things just made an already bad situation even worse. So certainly our sympathies go out there for our Puerto Rican friends out there that are trying to manage through this. So I suppose the silver lining is that they are American citizens, so they do have the option to relocate to other states. Whether or not that ends up being better for them or not, it's up for debate. But at least Puerto Rico, and I'm trying really hard here to find a silver lining, but at least Puerto Rico is not in a situation like Honduras or Guatemala or some of these other Central American countries where the United States has played a pivotal role in destabilizing those governments, and then those people have to flee, and to add insult to injury, they get stopped at the border with Mexico and they have to endure inhumane conditions in Mexico. And even if they manage to get to the U.S., there's no guarantee that they'll be able to find a good work or sustainable living. So at least Puerto Ricans are not in that boat. So that's the silver lining.
Yeah, no, it is. But you bring a good point because I think a lot of people left Puerto Rico. Um, I think during 1950s or so to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
to fill a lot of jobs. And actually, before that, I know that that's one of the reasons why there's so many Puerto Ricans in the East Coast that were recruited to work as farmers and other manufacturing labor. But obviously, little by little, those people went back and went to retired. So a lot of the people who were impacted by Maria and who had the means to leave the island, they did leave Puerto Rico, and a lot of them went to Orlando and other areas in the mainland. But to your point, I think that Puerto Ricans That's why one of the reasons why both parties, particularly in Florida, try to court them because they are citizens. They are, and a lot of them are very civically involved and civically engaged, right? So I think that they do have that power, and I think they're trying to use that political power to bring some attention to what's going on in the island. And the other thing is a good number of them are going back, sending money to relatives. And there's also a lot of other non-Puerto Ricans from the mainland who are going there to, again, buy buy property or to live there to take advantage of the type of tax incentives that benefit them and their businesses if you have a certain amount
Mm-hmm.
of money. So there's this interesting uh, inflow of 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 folks from outside the island. In addition to as a beautiful island in the Caribbean, there's a lot of tourism, and tourism obviously was impacted during the pandemic. But I think now, as things start opening up, people are starting to rediscover Puerto Rico, and a lot of those folks who get into fights when they're on the plane or when they land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and one other thing with Puerto Rico is that what's going on in Puerto Rico in a way is really not unique in the sense that we have a lot of states in the US that are also struggling with their budgets.
Hmm.
And it was interesting to watch some of these videos. I saw one where there's a forum of some economists that they're somehow in sectors that are related to Puerto Rico and the debt and issuance of debt and all of that. So they know the politics and the economics of Puerto Rico. And it was fascinating to hear this panel of experts talk about financial responsibility and how Puerto Rico is in this debt crisis, and they use all of the lingo of restructuring debt, paying back debt, responsibility, like all of the things that you would expect like a grown up person to do in terms of managing a debt, right? If you're a responsible person. But then I was thinking like, it's so funny how none of these seem to apply to our own federal government, where we just keep printing money and it doesn't
Or
matter that
Wall
our
Street,
yeah, exactly,
right?
Wall Street. It doesn't seem to matter that our we can't balance the books, and we can't seem to. We're always raising the debt ceiling to borrow more to pay our ever growing debt. So I was thinking, like, yeah, it's funny when it comes to Puerto Rico, we actually get serious and we talk about financial responsibility like grown-ups should. But when it comes to like the U.S. federal government, that doesn't seem to exist. I mean, the U.S. federal government could just print money out of nothing. Actually, if they wanted to, they could print $1 trillion and give it to Puerto Rico.
They could. And actually, you make me think. Now I'm curious whether or not there's any, like, what amount of money is included in the pending bills, infrastructure bills, which I know are getting
Dude,
smaller
yeah,
as
it's smaller and
negotiations
smaller.
continue.
Well, I think it may have started with some money allocated to Puerto Rico, and by now it's been cut away. I bet you that if they started cutting Puerto Rico's uh, allotment, was the first one that got pulled out.
Yeah, and I know that, Representative Nidia Velázquez, she's from Puerto Rico, and she's represents New York, but she and other members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus do try to advocate for the island and make sure that they are included in any type of measure and bill. But unfortunately, again, they don't have their own representatives or their own senators to be able to advocate more effectively in the island. And sadly, while they can vote in the primary elections, they can't vote for president.
Yeah, they can. That's true. It's a good call out. Yeah, it's not. It doesn't look good. I didn't know the situation was this dire for Puerto Rico, because I would only hear about it every year or so. Oh, okay. There's like some turmoil going on in Puerto Rico. Oh, Hurricane Maria hit them, but I didn't know how pervasive this crisis was, going back, say, the last since 2006, when those corporate subsidies phased out.
Yeah, and I think the other piece is that related to Hurricane Maria recovery. Unfortunately, the help that they got from FEMA, I mean, it was a disastrous response that FEMA had. But then under the Trump administration, they made the island accept to get aid through a very different provision of the FEMA Act, which has slowed down
Mm-hmm.
the reconstructions of hospitals. So, for instance, the island of Vieques, where the hospital was completely destroyed by the hurricane, they haven't been able to rebuild it. So there's inequalities and issues within the islands that make up Puerto Rico, but that's a big thing, right? So that the aid is not getting there, and then that money is they're not getting the money they need to rebuild their infrastructure. So their
Mm-hmm.
electric bill, they just
Yeah, they
privatized
privatized it, and now they're having
the electric.
blackouts.
Yeah, and that's been a big issue, a lot of protests because I mean it continues to be a very unreliable grid, but
But
that's
I
because you
but
need billions of dollars to be able to get it up to you know to be a resilient grid, and a grid that can function
Mhm.
better than what it currently
Well,
does.
I thought the private sector was supposed to be more efficient at this,
That's what they say.
right? Do you remember when Trump was? I think it was around Hurricane Maria, where he was throwing paper towels at people, giving them
Yep.
out, and he must
How
have
can I
thought, "Look at
forget?
me! It's on video. I look so great handing out paper towels," and it was just so condescending the way that he was giving them scraps.
Well, remember, I think he said he wanted to sell the island. I forgot what he wanted to sell it for, but
At least before they pretended, they try to hide their intent behind the type of language of the Commonwealth language, and now like Trump, that doesn't even, he's just like, yeah. And I think at some point he was caught also just talking disparagingly about the Puerto Rican people, that they couldn't get their shit together, that they're in that mess because of their own doing, and that, I don't know if he said we shouldn't help them, but he was certainly criticizing them a lot. And again, I go back to thinking, yeah, well, our government doesn't do that either. We don't balance our budget. We borrow more than we should. We're in debt. So really, what's happening with Puerto Rico is very similar to what's happening in a lot of states. Yet the language changes when it comes to Puerto Rico.
sad but true.
All right. Well, look, let's wrap it up here. I know that this was just scratching the surface. I think as I do more research on this, I maybe check out this La Brega podcast and maybe go read a book or two on Puerto Rico, especially the history of it. I think for our next conversation that we have on this, maybe in 6 months or a year, hopefully things are looking better, but we'll be able to provide more insight and more background also on this. So let's wrap it up here. Any final words?
No, yeah. So, sending good vibes to the people in Puerto Rico. I think, despite all the challenges, they're such an amazing group of folks. So happy, so full of life. They give so much, not only to Latin America but to the U.S. and to the world. So I know that as they have for the past 529 years, they'll continue to do what they need to do to stay in La Brega and bring this world all that wonderful Puerto Ricanness that they bring to us.
Eso. All right. Nos vemos.
Ciao.